We're going to do a Russian version. Oh, where'd you go? So you're not flying this?
No, I was born in New York, but when I was finishing school, I was in year end. I was approached by the University of Krakow. That's where I was living and working for beforehand. And that's what I think is funny. I think most actors like to have an American accent. Well, you gotta work some weekends or you gotta work weekends.
Yeah.
Or I can go back to Krakow and teach and so bigger budget.
We were 2 years ago.
Looking at the schedule.
Everybody knows. It's just 3.
It's actually the largest mini.
Yeah.
You've been to the other.
I've been back since they completed that. It's still fairly good.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. That was.
We didn't even know it existed.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of
Yeah.
that.
We took a tour.
I was looking around when I saw everybody I know, and then I saw it was
Where are you? And what are you doing here?
I'm a senior program officer for projects.
yeah, we were talking about it. Because Richard was presented to me. It's amazing because everybody Richard wasn't doing that. And but you, what, how is
So I'm a fellow foreign policy researcher, and in any case, I'm on a project. So because I work in the non-Arab states in the Middle East, all kind of on the periphery of Europe. I'm on a project with some kind of technical results. So anyways, Miriam's today right now.
that's right.
Yeah, I'm also working on an article, roughly speaking, so right now. I've been doing network marketing opportunities where I've lived or continue to do so. I was yesterday with so a group of us from the PRI's project speaking to a bunch of U.S. diplomats who are interested in the press war. To Russia, Moscow very soon, this yesterday. And those who follow Pakistan, I know some are suggesting that yes, it may occur to those of us who are not. We're suggesting that, yeah, it could be that, part of the continuing narrative that Russia is playing a fire with the excuse for agreement, what have you. And that Kazakhstan could establish a connection with that. Once the word Belarus starts getting about rights. So there is some suspicion here.
Last night. Julia, how are you? Hello, Mr. Kumar. Sorry. No. Be careful. Don't sue me. Hi. How are you? No.
Oh, years and years ago, I was working in Georgia, following to ALPG. Yeah, great.
Where are you?
Now I'm at NED, Democracy. King or Marion this afternoon.
What's that?
King or Marion this afternoon.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're all slated. Sometimes they keep it for the speakers. If you say so, if they ask me off, I'll go if you told me to sit there. Because have their seats. Yeah, but sometimes they sit, wait till they introduce. What do you do?
I think now I'm responsible for programs that concern the keeps me asking. It's a year this month. Down there.
What's that?
Down there has a tendency to find people that
Oh, yeah. So where's Miriam? She should be here.
she's with the nursing home.
What?
Yeah, she's her kids, right?
No.
Three of them. Okay.
Natalia. They were testifying. David Senator in Russia. He's reading.
Good afternoon. Works. My name is John Herbst. I'm the director of the Dinu Patricio Eurasia Center, and I'm delighted to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. We've got a wonderful program. 4 experts and me to talk about the elections coming up in Russia. We'll have 5 minutes of discussion, each of our experts, moderated by Steve Myers, and then we'll take questions. Our panelists include Vladimir Kara-Murza, Dr. Miriam Lanskoy, Mr. Pavel Hodorkovsky, myself, and of course Steve Myers. And with that, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great turnout. I'm Steve Myers from the New York Times. And I would start by saying that for a journalist, it's sometimes tempting to look at an election like this coming up and either ignore it or dismiss its significance. I think a lot of people assume the outcome is predetermined, more or less. That this system is rigged in many ways, certainly against genuine opposition in Russia. But nonetheless, I think each of the elections that have been held in Russia, and my first one was in 2003, in the parliamentary elections, I think each one has unique characteristics, and each one has always been an important hinge moment in the country because of the context of when they're held, the context surrounding them. 2003 was very much about Putin solidifying his majority in parliament. 2007 was about the transition to Medvedev and Putin stepping aside briefly. 2011, of course, everyone knows the protests that followed after the rigging of that. And each of those, I think, were important moments in understanding Putin's power, what was happening in the country broadly, and so forth. And so I think it's really important that we do pay attention. And today we have some great experts who are going to help us understand the context for these elections coming up. John already introduced everyone, but for those who don't know you or who are listening, don't know our panelists, Vladimir Kara-Murza is the deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party, which is one of the liberal democratic parties in Russia. He's also the coordinator of Open Russia, a platform for civil society that was launched in 2014 by Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was an advisor to Boris Nemtsov and is a prolific journalist and writer as well. He's the author of a book, Reform or Revolution, The Quest for Responsible Government in the First Russian State Duma, which was published in Moscow in 2011. Next, we have Miriam Lanskoy, who's the Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy. Her book, The Chechen Struggle, Independence Won and Lost, which she co-authored with Ilyas Akhmatov, was published in 2010. She's also published widely, appeared on television, and testified before Congress. And we also have Pavel Khodorkovsky, who is the son of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who we've already mentioned. He's the president of the Institute of Modern Russia, which he co-founded with the Open Russia Foundation to continue the work of his father in promoting civil society and rule of law in Russia. And with that, I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a few minutes and give their perspective on this election, and then I'll have the prerogative of asking the first questions, and then we'll open it up for what I hope is a great discussion and debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting us here today for this important discussion. Any day now, we're expecting a decree from Vladimir Putin officially calling the parliamentary election for the third Sunday of September, September the 18th. He has from May 31st until June the 20th to call this election. We thought it already would be done by now, but it hasn't. And I just checked 5 minutes ago before coming in. He still hasn't signed it, but it will be signed in the next few days. And we, of course, know the date already because it's been set by law. It was a special law that was rammed through last year with dubious constitutionality, as so many things that they do. Because, of course, as you know, the voting day originally was supposed to take place in December, as with every parliamentary election in Russia beginning in 1993. But this time they decided to bring it 3 months forward in order for the peak of the campaigning season to coincide with the peak of the vacation season, when most people, at least in the big cities, would be away on their dachas or vacationing abroad or doing anything except focusing on politics and elections. Because, of course, as we know, low turnout favors the regime because it increases the importance of the voting bloc that they fully control. State employees, people they bus around, people they compel to come to vote. But of course, shifting the date is by far not the only manipulation that accompanies this current campaign. In the last 8 weeks, the Kremlin and the Duma have rubber-stamped a whole slate of new draconian laws that target both the campaign itself and the election observation process. For example, parties and candidates will no longer be able to use endorsements from people who are themselves, for varying reasons, not allowed to run in elections as candidates. And it's a grand-sounding phrase, but this whole new federal law was passed for just 2 people, Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Alexei Navalny. In terms of the observation, election monitors will no longer be able to travel in mobile groups between polling places in order to respond to instances of fraud as they did in 2011. Instead, they will now be tied to specific polling places which they will not be allowed to leave, and they'll have to register those polling places at least 3 days ahead of the vote. In other words, the authorities will know exactly which polling places will be covered by independent observers and which will not, with the resulting consequences. Media credentials will no longer guarantee access to the ballot count, again, as they did back in 2011 and in previous years. And this measure was specifically directed against Golos, which is Russia's largest and oldest vote monitoring association, which used its registered newspaper to issue media credentials to its monitors and then gain them access to the vote count. And that way, that avenue has been closed off. Of course, needless to say, opposition candidates and opposition leaders have continued to have no access to major media outlets, first and foremost national TV, except as targets of an ongoing smear and discrediting campaign, as happened recently with Mikhail Kasyanov, Alexei Navalny, and others. In terms of observation, again, the officials from the Foreign Ministry and the State Duma have already made it clear that observers from the Council of Europe will not be welcome to observe the Russian parliamentary election, in direct contradiction with our obligations under our membership of the Council of Europe. So I think it's safe to say that the situation we're in today is worse than it was 5 years ago in 2011, and that, frankly, was not a high benchmark either, because as we know, in that election, up to 14 million votes, according to independent estimates, were stolen in favor of Vladimir Putin's party, United Russia. And that election, of course, as we all remember, was followed by the largest street demonstrations under Mr. Putin's rule, when In Moscow alone, more than 100,000 people went out to the streets to protest against fraud. And so, as this election approaches, there's been an ongoing debate in the Russian opposition whether or not to even participate in this process and in the Russian democratic movement as a whole. And of course, one other important election preparation to mention that is not directly related to the vote, but actually very much is. 2 months ago in April, Mr. Putin signed a new law that set up a new armed formation, a new armed structure within the Russian government. It's called the National Guard. It will number 400,000 people. It will be commanded by Mr. Putin's longtime personal bodyguard, General Viktor Zolotov, and it will be under direct presidential command. And that new structure will have the right to use force, to arrest people, to enter people's homes, and to shoot without warning in the event of quote-unquote mass disturbances. And this is Kremlin speak for street demonstrations that followed fraudulent elections in other post-Soviet states, including Ukraine and Georgia. And so we've had this debate among ourselves for several months, in fact several years, whether or not to even participate in this fraudulent and flawed process. And this debate is not new to us, it's not new to Russia, it's been happening in other countries with similar authoritarian, autocratic regimes. But in the end, we have decided against the boycott, and we have decided to participate. Because I think as history shows pretty clearly, the history of such regimes, boycotts are meaningless, and boycotts do not work. And we must use every opportunity to challenge this regime, including through participation in this flawed, manipulated, and truncated electoral process. We know that there are many people in Russia who reject the autocracy, the corruption, the isolationism that have become the hallmarks of the present regime, who want to see a different Russia, modern, normal, European, democratic, a Russia where no one is above the law, where the government is chosen in free and fair elections, a Russia that respects both the rights of its own citizens and the international norms. And we owe it to these people to give them a political voice in this upcoming election and to give them an opportunity to vote and support an alternative. And this is exactly what we will be doing this September. We will be participating in this flawed, manipulated, and fraudulent electoral process in order to have our voices heard, in order to get our message across through that wall of lies, propaganda, and coercion that's been built by the current regime, in order to present an alternative vision. And as importantly, and perhaps most importantly, in order to help the new generation of Russian democratic activists, young people across the country, to gain the political experience and the political muscle that they will need and they will use in the future by participating in this process as candidates. And so the goal, the focus for the Open Russia movement, which I have the honor of representing this year, will be to support individual candidates in single-member districts across Russia. It's a wide geography from St. Petersburg to Irkutsk. We have 24 such candidates, and last week we held a large news conference in Moscow where we brought them all together and presented them to the press, to the media, and explained why we're doing what we're doing. Actually, probably the most popular question at that news conference in Moscow last week was, why do you even bother with this? What's the point? And the answer I responded with was actually a musical analogy. There was a world-famous Soviet pianist, Rudolf Kehrer, and he was exiled in the early 1940s to Kazakhstan as an ethnic German. And he spent 13 years in that exile in Kazakhstan. And needless to say, he didn't have a piano with him in the steppes of Kazakhstan, in a small barrack he was living with his family in. And so he took out a wooden plank, and he took out a knife, and he carved out a keyboard, and he practiced on it without sound so that his fingers wouldn't forget every day for 13 years. And then that exile ended, and he came back to Moscow. And in 1961, he won the USSR-wide musical soloist competition. And he became a soloist at the Moscow Philharmonic, and he taught at the Moscow Conservatoire, and later at the Vienna Conservatoire. He toured the whole world. He was one of the most accomplished and most talented pianists of his time. And for 13 years, he practiced on a wooden plank. So what we are doing this year in this so-called election in September 2016 is that wooden plank by Rudolf Kehrer. Because we know that a day will come when Russia will have a real free and fair election. We know that nothing is forever. And we know that this regime will end. And when that day comes, we will need that experience and those people with that experience. And so the work we're doing today is to prepare for that day and to get ready when the time comes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Miriam.
It is a great honor to be here, and especially to be here with Vladimir and that amazing clarity of vision and courage that he has displayed over and over again. Again, it's just a great honor to be here. I'm going to start in a similar place. Why does a president with 85% approval rating feel so insecure? We all know the outcome of this election. But the Russian government still has to do all kinds of things to clamp down even further. And the reason that they need to clamp down even further is that they're terrified of a repeat of the 2011-2012 protests. Putin told the FSB Collegium in February this year that foreign influences will destabilize our sovereignty through our elections, and you have to be on top of this threat. This is now becoming a traditional theme of these presentations. Last year, he told everyone to be on guard against foreign NGOs, and it always leads to greater repression. There was, in fact, recently an amendment to the Foreign Agents Act that expands the definition of political activities, so even more NGOs will be branded foreign agents under that legislation. We're also now seeing the first criminal investigation under the Foreign Agents Law. There have been many administrative cases, there have been fines, there have been organizations shut down, but we're now actually seeing the first criminal case. They replaced the head of the election committee, Churov, who was seen as the person responsible for the falsifications in 2011. He was replaced by Ella Pamfilova. This was a very cosmetic move to try to show, look, we don't need to conduct a lot of fraud on the day of the elections because we've got the whole thing covered beginning to end. We control every aspect of the elections. We can comply with the demand to remove Churov. We'll put a liberal in his place, and the whole thing will sort of have a prettier facade. Vladimir already mentioned the election monitoring restrictions. There are reduced opportunities for election monitoring, both by independent observers and by party proxies. There are new initiatives to control social media, and social media, of course, was the main organizing vehicle in 2011-2012. There are people now going to jail for likes and reposts on the Russian internet. There are physical attacks against opposition. Kasyanov attacked repeatedly, thugs breaking up his speaking engagements in the regions. Navalny and his team were attacked by Cossacks at the airport in Sochi, and one of the journalists traveling with him was hospitalized with severe concussions and so forth. Vladimir has mentioned Zolotov's National Guard. This is a 400,000 member fighting force, larger than the MVD at this point, directly through Putin's personal friend, reporting directly to Putin. And to make things even more clear, Zolotov is the family of Nemtsov, would like to see him questioned in connection with the killing of Nemtsov. So we can get a feeling for what that method is all about. So again, why do you need all of this? If Putin has 85% approval, if the opposition can barely get 10%, if one is generous, why do you need all of this? And I actually think that there's a lot of discontent in society. It might be a struggle to find a political outlet for it, but I think it's there. The economy is doing very badly. People are seeing their purchasing power erode tremendously. Levada reports 20% expect to see protests over consumer issues and economic issues. There's discontent with international isolation, the prospect of Russian athletes not being able to participate in the Olympics, not being able to travel to Egypt and Turkey for vacation and so forth. But I think the biggest vulnerability by far is kleptocracy. And kleptocracy might be an academic term. We might prefer mafia state. But there's increasing exposés conducted usually actually by Russian civil society itself. There's the Chaika documentary produced by Navalny's team that showed that the country's prosecutor general has mutual business interests with a criminal authority, Tsapok. Tsapok was responsible for killing. He was terrorizing a small community for many, many years, but then he killed 12 people, which was essentially an extortionist. So someone who refused to pay extortion was eliminated with the entire family of 12 people. So this kind of criminal authority has joint businesses with associates of the prosecutor general of the country. The Panama Papers showed a $2 billion celloist who is a friend of Putin's. And everyone understands that that's just one. Panama Papers is a small piece of it, right? We happen to know it because this leak became public, yet the understanding is that $2 billion is probably just a small piece of the overall pie. Levada again found that 59% of Russians believe that Putin is personally responsible for high-level corruption and economic mismanagement. So I think that in a context where ordinary Russians are being told every day that they must suffer economically, they must carry this burden of their food basket is eroding. They're eating less meat and vegetables. They can't afford fruit. Yet the top people around Putin are getting away with this kind of thing. I have a hard time believing that this really doesn't engender discontent. Finding a political form for it is difficult and may take time, but even if it doesn't happen, if it doesn't gel into a political movement immediately, surely by 2018, I think that it will. So I will stop there.
Thank you. Pavel?
Thank you. I would like to focus on the observation of the elections and Russia's international obligations in terms of inviting and allowing international observers monitoring of the election sites. So basically, I'd like to cover three topics. The most recent statements of the Russian state officials in anticipation of the elections this coming September, and the actual obligations as part of participation in organizations such as OSCE and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, as well as the previous international evaluations of previously held elections. So if we look back to the beginning of this year, in January, we've had the head of the State Duma Committee for International Relations, Alexei Pushkov, mentioning about the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe that their mission would not be allowed to take part in monitoring of Russian polls until a delegation from Moscow is given back its full rights in the Assembly. Then in February, Sergei Naryshkin, who is the Speaker of the Duma, said that no one expects observers from the Parliamentary Assembly at the upcoming September elections. And finally, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Alexei Meshkov, mentioned again that I do not see any reason to invite observers from Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to the 2016 Duma election. Why is this important? I mean, all these statements make it pretty clear that the mission would not be invited to observe. It is important because under the Council of Europe's Convention for the Protection of Human Rights, it's actually written into the protocol that the conditions must be ensured for the free expression of the opinion of the people in the choice of the legislature. So traditionally, the members of the Council of Europe are expected to invite international observers to ensure that such free and fair elections are taking place. Granted, this is a little bit of a contentious issue, given that the voting rights are currently suspended. Hence, the Russian officials have been making this point again and again in a quid pro quo scenario. Hence, we're not being allowed to fully participate. We will not respect our obligations and will not invite the observers. However, membership of Russia in the OSCE is much less ambiguous. In a sense, if we look at the OSCE's Copenhagen document at numerous sections that specify how the elections of the member states should take place, there are multiple references of permitting political campaigning to be conducted in a free and fair atmosphere, and specifically, the participating states should consider that the presence of observers, both foreign and domestic, can enhance the electoral process for the states in which elections are taking place. They therefore invite observers from any other CSE participating states and any appropriate private institutions and organizations who may wish to carry out the observation procedures. Now, if you look at previous OSCE's missions and the traditional period of notification that should be given to OSCE of its mission being invited to monitor the elections, that period is typically a 3 months deadline before the elections. So if we're expecting the elections to take place on the 18th of September, that places the deadline for the long-term's mission invitation literally 1 week from now. Such invitation has not yet been sent, which is worrisome because it would practically eliminate, together with the expected non-participation of the Parliamentary Assembly's mission, any foreign respected organizations' independent monitoring of the electoral process. Now, the logic in actually allowing the OSCE's long-term mission for the benefit of Russian state is that it would help advance the idea that free and fair elections are actually taking place. So in line with Vladimir's position on not boycotting the electoral process, I think the same argument applies for not boycotting the observation of the election process itself. And co-chairman of GOLAS, the organization that Vladimir mentioned, an election monitoring organization, one of the oldest, probably the oldest operating in Russia, Grigory Milkoyanets, reckons that Russia's interests will be best served if, after all, the observation mission will be present at elections. So we should note that the deadline is coming up, and currently no such mission has been invited.
Thank you. John?
Thank you. I'd like to offer you a few thoughts looking at these elections from Washington and what they mean in terms of the great debate that's going on in the West regarding events in Russia and policy towards Russia. The first thought picks up an idea that actually both Vladimir raised and actually other panelists too, about why do you have to have all of these restrictions on who can participate, on the way they participate, on the role of observers? Why are all of these things necessary if Mr. Putin's popularity ratings really are 80%? And I ask this question because those of us working on policy towards Russia who believe that we are facing a revisionist Kremlin face opponents who say that the policies that Mr. Putin is following are inevitably the policies you can expect from Russia. Look, his ratings are 80%. My sense is that a politician who's actually polling 80% or even 75%, a hard 75%, is not going to worry about a free and fair election, is not going to need to put restrictions on his opponents. And we've seen other polls already cited on this panel suggesting that, such as 59% of the Russian public thinking that Mr. Putin is responsible for corruption, or a poll not cited yet showing that a majority of Russians believe that Russia is heading in the wrong direction. So what I take away from this whole discussion of the elections is that, in fact, Mr. Putin's popularity is really not that high. Point one. Point two, an almost a simple question, maybe even simplistic. Why elections at all? If you pay close attention to the theoretical statements which come from Russian academics, the policy statements coming from Russian officials, or the Russian media, you know that at least they claim that Russia is a distinctive civilization, a Eurasian civilization, that has its own traditions. It is not part of the corrupt West. And of course, the way the West suggests that a society should be governed is not the Russian way. And of course, Mr. Putin and his friends in Russia and his friends here talk about those 80% polls to say this man is legitimate. But let me offer a thought for you, that he needs the elections because he doesn't know any other way ultimately to legitimize himself to his own population or internationally. And that's why you have all of the problems that we're discussing today. You know, all the restrictions that would prevent an accurate reading of the Russian public being presented and being the basis upon which you have seats distributed in the Duma. Point three, and this also has been raised by our other panelists. Why in the world should real Democrats, real Russian Democrats, participate in this election? After all, we could probably sit down right now and tally the official results. In fact, that would be a good exercise if we all secretly did that and we had it in a safe place so we could pull them out the day after the election. The reason why is related to question 2. Because ultimately, elections do provide legitimacy, despite all the garbage that's put out by the vast propaganda apparatus of the Kremlin. And the parties participate so they are seen as participating, so they develop experience, and so that after the results come in, on the basis of the best information available regarding the true results, you can have further developments in Russia. Now, the folks who are responsible for the Kremlin information campaign would say, aha, there's that Uber hawk suggesting revolution in Russia. No. What's happening is I am simply suggesting that all societies have a right to have their voices heard. And those voices can be heard either through a legitimate election or through conversation and assemblies that take place after an imperfect, or for that matter, a stolen election. And with that, that's my contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone up here. I would start by asking about one of the more recent developments and what you might call one of these unique characteristics of this election cycle, and that was the nationwide primaries that were held recently. My understanding is it was kind of an attempt to energize the base, if you will, of United Russia, that it's become such a moribund, institutionalized party that there seems to, going to the ambassador's point about legitimacy, there seems to be a desire to show that there is some kind of democratic process. Nikolai Petrov was in town, and he was describing it as more of a competition, not a democratic one, but among the elite. And this primaries is a way to show people that they have some say in this party that is generally fairly remote from the ordinary Russians, I mean. So I would ask, maybe for Vladimir, but then everyone can weigh in if they want. What do you see, what do you make of the primary process, both for the main party, but also then for the others as well, including your own?
Thanks for the question, Steve. Well, I think as with so many other institutions, the Kremlin here takes a form, a shape of a genuine institution that does exist in developed democratic countries such as primaries here in the U.S. and just completely hollows out. I mean, it has nothing in common in terms of substance. This so-called primary of United Russia took place at the end of May. It took place in a very traditional fashion, for that party and for that regime. And people were, first of all, the turnout was tiny. It was like 3% or something like that. And those 3%, most of those were people who were compelled to vote because they're state employees, so they're pressured into doing it, or they were bussed around, or they were just, somebody signed up for them and used the ballot papers. I mean, first of all, the procedure was had nothing in common with what real primaries would look like in a real democratic system. And secondly, I think, even the results of this process will not matter much when the actual party lists are formed for the election. And for instance, there were several high-profile people who lost in these primaries, including Mr. Pushkov, whom Pavel mentioned, the chairman of the Duma Foreign Affairs Committee. I have no doubt that he will be on the list come September the 18th, and he will be in the next Duma. So in no way is this a real, genuine process that I think we should, frankly, be paying attention to. It's just one of those fig leaves that the regime uses.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? I would also ask about another change or a return to previous practice of the individual mandates of the districts. Instead of being voted entirely on the party list, they've returned to having half the seats chosen by districts. Does that increase the possibility, do you think, that other people could make their way into the parliament, and maybe not as a major bloc, but to win some of the seats as they did in previous elections, whether the opposition or the systemic opposition, the communists, I mean, are they likely to use that new wrinkle effectively?
Could I? Yeah, well, I think there are two ways to look at this. First of all, on the surface, the reinstatement of single-member districts, which will be the first time they've used since 2003, so in 13 years. On the one hand, it's one of the few things that remain from the so-called Bolotnaya thaw. When in December 2011, we had 100,000 people standing across the river from the Kremlin, and the regime was running pretty scared, so it began to issue one concession after another. If you recall that last week of December, they reinstated gubernatorial elections, which Mr. Medvedev just a year previously said will not return for 100 years. All it took was 100,000 people across the river from the Kremlin. They reinstated them like that. They reduced the membership requirement to register political parties from 40,000 to 500. They reduced the number of signatures to register for the presidential election. And one of the things they also did was to change the parliamentary election law. So they reduced the threshold from 7 to 5% on the list component. And they reinstated the single-member districts that you mentioned. So we will have them this year. Again, going from this side, it does, I think, offer important opportunities for independent voices to at least take part in election. I'm not saying to actually win and or get it instated as members of parliament, but in any case to participate. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, this will be the focus of our own movement of Open Russia, to support those individual candidates, not on the party list, but who are running as individual candidates in those constituencies. By the way, both for the National Parliament, the Russian State Duma, and for the Legislative Assembly of St. Petersburg, which will also have elections simultaneously on September the 18th. So those 24 candidates I mentioned will be running as individuals in those individual seats. And two things I'd like to mention in that regard. First of all, I think it's important to mention this. We even have this opportunity this year to nominate independent and opposition candidates and to nominate alternative voices in this election because of Boris Nemtsov. Because 2.5 years ago, he won a legislative seat in the region of Yaroslavl, which according to Russian law, if a political party is represented in one of the regional parliaments, it has the right of automatic ballot access, and it does not need to collect the signatures to submit them for registration, which usually serves as a filter for getting unwanted candidates off the ballot. In 99% of cases, opposition candidates are disqualified from the ballot on the basis of quote-unquote incorrect signatures. Because of Boris Nemtsov's seat in Yaroslavl, we don't need to overcome that hurdle. And this is why we have this opportunity to nominate and register those candidates. This is not to say that all of our candidates will make it onto the ballot. There are other ways of disqualifying those that don't want to see them. For instance, tomorrow, on June the 10th, there'll be a session of the regional court in the city of Kostroma, which will pass a sentence, and I'm not doubting it will be a guilty sentence, against one of my colleagues at Open Russia and at the People's Freedom Party, Andrei Pivovarov, who's our parliamentary candidate in St. Petersburg. Hopefully it's going to be a suspended sentence, so he's not actually going to be handcuffed and taken to jail from the court, but even a suspended sentence, according to the article he's been charged with, carries with it a ban on taking part in elections as a candidate. So that will happen tomorrow. Another one of our candidates, Yegor Savin in Novosibirsk, he had a police raid on his campaign headquarters a couple of weeks ago. And the police came in, it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and within 5 minutes of coming in, they, quote-unquote, found a brochure which had a picture of a swastika on it. So they charged him with administrative code violation number 20.1, which is storage and dissemination of Nazi symbols, which carries with it a small fine, but also disqualification from the ballot and the impossibility to register as a candidate in the election. And we'll be seeing, I think, more of those cases around. So I'm not doubting that most of our candidates probably will not even be allowed to run, but I think some will. Again, because of this ballot access that we have, because of Boris Nemtsov, I think some will. And those that will, I think, will break another very important and founding myth of the Putin regime. It's been mentioned already several times, this bogus 85% that the regime supposedly has. And I completely agree with what Miriam and Ambassador Herbst has said. If you have 85%, you don't need to censor television. You don't need to put people in jail. You don't need to rig elections if you have 85%. And so the other side of this myth is that the opposition has nothing, that those in Russia who believe in a democratic and European future have no public support, that we have 2% of the vote. Well, that is a lie. And we have proved that that is a lie. Because in those very rare cases when genuine opposition candidates are actually allowed on the ballot, they score very impressive results. Let's remember Alexei Navalny's 30% of the vote in Moscow 2.5 years ago, even officially. Let's remember again Boris Nemtsov's victory in Yaroslavl, which I already mentioned. Both candidates supported by Open Russia in elections last year, one in St. Petersburg in the municipal vote, one in Novosibirsk in the regional vote, both, even according to the official results, got more than 20% of the vote and came second to pro-Putin candidates. This is the truth, not the myths or lies or stereotypes. And I think those of our candidates who will make it onto the ballot in those single-member districts that you mentioned will, again, disprove that myth and show very impressive results.
John?
I'd just like to make the point regarding having geographically based seats. I think it's a concession by Mr. Putin to local elites. And those local elites will determine the outcome of those elections much the way that the Kremlin will determine the outcome of the major elections. So it gives the local leaders who are more or less comfortable with Mr. Putin a little bit more, while it keeps everything very safe for the top leadership in Moscow. If the opposition is able to, in a few places, make a breakthrough, that's wonderful. But I think there are going to be substantial barriers to that.
The one other question I'd like to ask broadly, and it's a little bit unfair given the obstacles I think that the opposition faces, but there does seem to be, and it's not new, difficulty in unifying the opposition, creating a bloc that would maybe be able to get certainly over the threshold and get back into the parliament. And I mean, I acknowledge all of the obstacles that people face. as has been mentioned here. But why is that so difficult? Why is it difficult to maintain the momentum you saw with the major protests after the last election, or even, as you mentioned, the Navalny performance in 2013, an election I covered, and he seemed, for a moment, maybe this was a thaw, able to bring together a coalition that was, I think it was 29%, the exact outcome on that, which was pretty impressive given that he wasn't on TV. Why is that seemingly difficult leading into this election?
Well, I think one of the major obstacles is the prohibition on actually forming electoral blocks to get over the threshold, but also the very fact of the lowering of the threshold, if we're just talking about the limitations and, in this case, motivations that have been put in place to further fragment the opposition, the lowering of the registration limits and the admission to the Duma limit further encourages fragmentation of the opposition and formation of these really small parties who by themselves have very little chance of getting the necessary number of votes to get into the Duma, combined with the prohibition on forming blocks that pretty much statistically eliminates the majority of the chances to get into the parliament. But more so, I think you should look at the two primary competing movements in the opposition, and we're not talking about here about all of the parties that are representing the opposition. Perhaps some of them are officially sanctioned, which again is in most cases widely understood even within Russia. But if we just look at the liberal faction and the nationalistic faction, in many cases you would be competing against one another and for a very limited number of seats. And again, given the low limits, that further encourages fragmentation, given that the two factions are very unlikely to form a coalition and back the same candidates. Again, if you look at it from the statistical perspective, that further eliminates your chances of getting into the parliament.
Just quickly follow up on this. First of all, Pavel is absolutely right, and the main reason is that they prohibited electoral blocks, and that was specifically targeted at the pro-democracy parties, because we are the only ones who could potentially have formed such a bloc. And I mean Yabloko and the People's Freedom Party, the two traditional pro-democracy parties in Russia. And of course, so they banned the blocks back in 2004. Then in 2005, we went around that by putting members of the SPS party on the list of the Yabloko party, so de facto creating a bloc. Then they passed another law saying that members of one party are not allowed to be on another party's list, and whatever we do, they pass a special law to prohibit that. But even in this current environment, we still have some limited. So I completely, first of all, take the criticism of this, because I think it's a major mistake on our part as well. Without external circumstances, but also we could have done a better job on this. But however, there are some limited success stories even in this election, in this field that you're asking about, the unification. And it also has to do with the single member district that you, Steve, mentioned. So we have a working group now working in Moscow between the two main democratic parties, the People's Freedom Party, which I'm the co-chairman of the working group for that, and Yabloko. Nikolai Rybakov is the co-chairman from Yabloko side, and we meet every week. We go through the lists of those districts and the candidates that we have in those districts. So last week, we've been able to come to a decision that in two of the districts in Moscow, and actually two very important districts in Moscow, one the very center and one northwest, which traditionally has a high pro-democracy vote, we will nominate joint candidates, and we will agree to unite around single candidates. In the central district of Moscow, it is Professor Andrei Zubov, a prominent historian, formerly professor of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry, who was fired in 2014 after publicly comparing Putin's annexation of Crimea with Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland. But he still has a very big following. He's one of the most widely listened to public lecturers. So he'll be nominated as a candidate for our party, the People's Freedom Party, in the center of Moscow, and Yabloko will support him. And then in the northwest of Moscow, in Tushinsky district, Yabloko will nominate Dmitry Gudkov, who currently is the only opposition member of the Russian State Duma, and we as the People's Freedom Party will support him there. So I know it's small, I know it's much less than it should have been, but at least 2 success stories we already achieved, and hopefully we will continue to work on this, and there'll be more success stories to talk about.
So now we get to open this up to your questions, and if I remember the process here, there are 2 microphones, and if we could ask you to identify yourself and your affiliation, and then ask away. Right here.
Yes. Eleanor Bachrach, former USAID, including in Ukraine. Mr. Karamurza, very impressive presentation. You mentioned that Putin has created this 400,000 strong National Guard. You also said basically these repressive laws have covered all aspects of the election process, but the one thing I didn't hear was the individual's right to a secret ballot. Do you anticipate interference even with that right and perhaps violence at polling places?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, the right to secret ballot, unfortunately, has been violated for many years now, and I have all the reasons to expect that it will happen the same this year. And the way to do it is that, again, the voting bloc that they fully control are the state employees and those who work for state-affiliated institutions, be it municipal services or factories with state control, or those affiliated with regional authorities. So what they do is they tell those people to take a picture of the ballot paper once they vote, and then show it for whom they voted. If they don't do it, they'll be either fired or have their salaries reduced or have their premiums not paid or whatever. I mean, there are different ways of pressuring people. I mean, of course, Russian people are resourceful. There have been ways found around it. For instance, you can have a little piece of film with a cross or a V on it. You'd put it, you take a picture, then you throw it out. You vote however you want. So there have been cases like this as well. But if you're talking in particular about this aspect, yeah, that has been violated before. Unfortunately, that's not the only violation we've seen. I mean, of course, the biggest one was just plain stealing of the votes. And we know from the parallel vote counts and reports from independent observers that in 2011, up to 14 million votes, as I mentioned, were stolen in favor of Mr. Putin's party. They received, in reality, about 35%. The official result was 49%. And obviously, that messed with the whole result as well. So we can't even, begin to. We'll be hours here if we spend talking about different ways they violate the basic rights to free and fair elections, which, as Pavel mentioned a minute ago, are actually part of our international obligations as a member of the OSCE, as a member of the Council of Europe. But you pick any aspect of the electoral process, they'll find a way to violate it.
She follows up with the violence, the question of
Oh, the violence?
possibility of that.
Well, I think, as I already said, there's no other reason for setting up this new structure, the National Guard, other than to put down mass demonstrations that they're expecting after the elections and after the fraud in the elections. Because all these different units were already in existence, they had their functions, they functioned fine, there were no problems. And this National Guard will incorporate the former Interior Ministry troops, the former SWAT teams, the former Special Riot Police. I mean, they did exist before, and they did have their own jurisdictions and their own, areas of function. But now they brought it all together. They brought it under a person who is a Putin loyalist and friend for many years, this General Zolotov that we mentioned, and it will be under direct presidential command. There's no other reason for doing it than to put down street demonstrations, and it's actually in the statute. Quote-unquote mass disturbances is what it's there for. So they are, again, going back to the 85% question. They are expecting it.
We have a question up here in the front row. If you could wait for the...
R.L. Cohn, the Atlantic Council on Resident Senior Fellow. Volodya, great to see you here in one piece, thank God.
Almost.
Almost. Question about your party's position on the Crimea and the statements ascribed to one Maria Baronova, that expressed support to the occupation of Crimea. We here at the Atlantic Council do support return of the Crimea to Ukraine, as you know. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, Maria Baronova is not a member of the People's Freedom Party. In fact, I mentioned earlier that most of the Open Russia candidates will be nominated by the People's Freedom Party in order to gain automatic ballot access. She's the only one who's not. She will not be nominated by the People's Freedom Party. She will go as an independent and collect signatures, so I'll leave it to her to respond for her own position. She's not a member of our party. But you raise a very important issue in terms of Crimea as part of the election process, because that was a very controversial issue a couple of months ago, and it still is, and it still may be, for the reasons I'll mention in a minute. As you know, when you submit a nationwide list of candidates to the Central Electoral Commission to get registered for the election, you also have to provide a breakdown of your regional groups of candidates. And of course, according to Mr. Putin's law, that now includes Crimea and Sevastopol, which you also have to provide separate regional groups for. So the only two parties that are refusing to provide a separate special candidates group for Crimea and for Sevastopol are the People's Freedom Party and Yabloko, the only two parties that have refused to recognize the annexation of Crimea. So what we're doing is we found a loophole in the election law which allows you to group different regions together. You can only do it with neighboring regions. Like, for instance, Pskov and Novgorod. You can group them together and create one northwestern group, let's say. So the way we're going to go about this is we're going to lump in Crimea and Sevastopol together with the Krasnodar region, which is the only neighboring one, in order to make a statement that we do not recognize the legality of this, and we're not going to provide a separate candidates group for Crimea and for Sevastopol. However, just recently, in the last week, literally, we've heard a word from the Central Electoral Commission that they are going to prohibit, they will still allow grouping different regions together, except for Crimea and Sevastopol. And they will oblige every party that will be submitting lists of candidates to have a separate group of candidates in Crimea and in Sevastopol. This hasn't been official yet. We've heard about this last week. And we will have our party congress next week on the 18th of June. Yabloko will have one the following week on the 25th of June. And if that does happen, we're going to have a very heated debate at that Congress, because for many people it's an important issue. We do not recognize the legality of this, and therefore we're not going to, we don't want to submit a separate list of candidates for that. But for now, as the law stands now, we found this loophole, and this is what we're going to do. Yes, she's an independent candidate who will collect signatures to get registered, yeah. She's, in fact, the only one who is not running as the People's Freedom Party candidate. So,
if I may follow up, is there a potential that could end up disqualifying the entire list? That wrinkle in the law that
absolutely. So that's the reason they're doing it. Either you recognize this, or you're not going to be allowed to run at all.
And can you just leave the slate blank?
No, that's the thing. You have to provide names for each regional group. So the best way that we, both us and Yabloko separately decided to do it, is to lump it in together and call this group the Krasnodar region, because that's obviously part of the Russian Federation. That's part of our internationally recognized territory, and just lump that kind of, within. But as I said, there's been word that they will prohibit this practice, precisely aimed at us and at Yabloko.
This gentleman here in the fourth row. It's coming from that side. There you go.
Yuri Terekhov, NCSAG. Last month there were primaries of the Democratic Coalition. Could you please explain the situation with that, if the results were cancelled, or if you are going to follow the results of these primaries?
Thanks for the question. Well, the short answer is the party will decide its position on the 18th of June. As I mentioned, next Saturday is going to be our pre-election congress in Moscow. But I can tell you my personal position. I think those, and this goes back to what Steve asked earlier about this whole primaries process. I think the primaries process was sabotaged. It didn't take place. It was invalid because, as you know, the original expectation was for 100,000 people to register and to vote. In the end, only 24,000 people registered and only 7,000 voted. And not only because they couldn't be bothered to, but because voting had to be cancelled and stopped 9 hours ahead of the scheduled time because there was a break-in, or what we're still trying to find out what exactly happened, but there was a basically all the personal data of people who registered to vote was published, online, put online with people's cell phones, email addresses, IP addresses, and so forth. So the process had to be stopped. And my position was, and we had a bureau meeting, which is the ruling body of the party in Moscow. We had a meeting last week, and I and several colleagues argued for not recognizing this because this process it wasn't valid. The procedure was broken. We cannot recognize it. But Mr. Kasyanov, the party leader, has a different position, and we will have, as I said, the party congress on the 18th of June next Saturday, and this is when the decision will be taken. So this was my personal position, but there hasn't been an official decision yet.
Okay, more questions? Surely we haven't exhausted them.
Oh, actually, I was not going to ask this question. I'm Karina Orlova. I'm working for Echo of Moscow, and I am also a contributing writer for the American Interest. But coming back to Maria Baronova, she's not from Parnas Party, but she is from Open Russia, which you, Vladimir, represent here. So my question is, why Mikhail Khodorkovsky supports people like Maria Baronova? Because that's a good question, who she is. And as far as me and everybody else knows, she's just a junkie, lowbrow junkie, and she has no achievement. And she officially said that she has a 9-year-old son. And she said, well, yes, 3 years ago I took LSD and other drugs, but now I'm done. Is it okay? I mean, it's not a question about Maria Baronova, it's a question about Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Does he differ from Vladimir Putin at all? Because he supports people like Maria Baronova and Yulia Yusik and some other like strange people, let's put it this way. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, okay, I can answer this in a general way. First, I don't feel comfortable talking for other people who haven't authorized me. And secondly, talking for people who are not here and are not here, present and cannot answer themselves. But I will answer the political part of your question. And this is also what Ariel alluded to in his point, that there are among the 24 candidates we often make this mistake, by the way, we call United Russia, and we mean to say Open Russia. 24 candidates that Open Russia is supporting. There are people with major differences in what they politically believe in. And this is a difference between a movement and a party. So when we're talking about the People's Freedom Party or Yabloko or others, that there's a firm set of political principles that candidates adhere to. When it is a movement, it's a much wider spectrum. And I can answer what Mikhail Khodorkovsky said on many occasions when he responded to similar questions. Why do you have such a wide group of people with different political views who don't agree with each other? His point is, and I already mentioned this earlier, that the main focus and the main point for us in this year's parliamentary election is to prepare and to train and to get a team ready when the time comes to transition from the Putin regime to a democratic Russia. This is the main focus. And again, this is what Mr. Khodorkovsky said on several occasions. The question, many questions, not just Crimea, but many other questions, will not be decided by a limited provisional government that will be in power between the fall of the Putin regime and free and fair elections that will be able to take place for a future Russian parliament. There will be a very limited scope of what that government will be able to do, and the main focus of that will presumably be to prepare the free and fair elections to take place, at which the Russian people will be hopefully able to make the choice in a free and fair election for the first time in many years. And this is why those candidates that Open Russia is supporting are not all affiliated with a particular party. They are not all affiliated with the same, same number of political principles, but they're about the transition period. And I'm sure when that transition period is over and when we'll have that free election, many of the candidates who are now supported by Open Russia will be on different sides of the political barricades. And I'm not going to make a comment whether Ms. Baronova and I will be on the same side. But thank you for the question.
We call it big tent politics here in this country. Question here in the...
Thank you. I'm Juliana Pilan with the Alexander Hamilton Institute. It's very painful for me to hear all of this, I should say. I used to be Vice President of Programs at IFES, International Foundation for Election Systems. And when we first went to Russia, we had high hopes. And it is truly, truly painful to hear all of this. At the same time, I want to commend Vladimir and Pavel, all of you, for superb presentations. My question very simply to all of you is, what would you realistically expect the United States to do now in the next few months? We know, Vladimir has mentioned before Congress and elsewhere, that we need to throw a light on what's going on. But specifically, what would you recommend for us, those of us who can do something in the United States and elsewhere, actually do?
Miriam, maybe you could take the first swing at that one.
Try a first swing at that. I would say, look, there are some basic things like calling a spade a spade. I think we have to comment clearly and at a high level when we see certain things unfolding, and I don't think we should be holding back our judgments when we do see things that are wrong. I think we can be doing a lot more with our public broadcasting and our efforts to speak to Russian people directly. And that can be done by government representatives, and it can be done through greater efforts at public diplomacy overall. I think we could be doing more to support civil society in Russia. A lot of donors have pulled out over the last year. There are various initiatives, such as there's this fund called Tasrif that has been tied up in Congress for a long time, but Movement on Tasrif could provide a lot of support to Russian civil society. I think there's a lot that could be done both from the public diplomacy perspective and support for civil society. I don't know if that...
I think Miriam laid out most of the specific things. I would simply emphasize the point that we should stand up for our principles and make it clear all the problems to a legitimate democratic vote that have been presented. And it's important that this be part of an overall policy designed to stand up to Mr. Putin's revisionist actions in Europe, which I've talked about in other places.
I think another specific point that is likely to play out in the near future is, even if there was a official state invitation for OSCE's long-term mission to observe, there is still going to be a deliberation, because usually we would expect that such invitation would be, and that's actually one of the reasons to why a long-term mission was not set up in Russia since 2003, I believe. Usually the invitation comes with certain limitations. And ultimately the decision whether to set one up within the proposed boundaries or not is going to come to a decision of member states. And as such, U.S. could weigh in on the necessity to provide the mission even within certain potential boundaries that could be imposed by the Russian government. In other words, I think even limited observation is better than no observation from OSCE at all.
Thank you very much for the question, first of all. And I think the main answer is very simple: just be honest. That's really the main important. That's the most important thing. I'll never forget how the day after Mr. Putin's so-called re-election in 2012, on March the 5th, we had a big rally in Moscow in Pushkin Square. So this was the day after the election. That was marked by disqualification of opposition candidates, including Grigory Yavlinsky, who was a Democratic opposition candidate then. It was marked by mass fraud again, mostly at that time not in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they were cleverer than in 2011, but in the southern regions, in the North Caucasus and so on and so forth, by mass falsification of protocols, by coercion, by bogus polling places that didn't exist but on paper provided votes for Putin, and so on and so on and so forth. I'm not mentioning more mundane things like lack of access to the media for opposition, and that goes without saying. So we had a mass rally to protest against that election fraud. It was, as I said, the evening of March the 5th on Pushkin Square. We were there with Boris Nemtsov, with Grigory Yavlinsky, with Mikhail Kasyanov, with many, many others. And as we were standing there was and so, the people who came in, tens of thousands of people, to say, that they were offended by this, by the way the so-called election went. And at the same time we were standing there was a statement published by the US State Department, which congratulated, first of all, Mr. Putin on his victory, and secondly, and frankly more offensively, the Russian people on holding the election. And I will never forget that. Seeing that sea of faces, Russian citizens in Moscow protesting against fraud, and the US administration issuing congratulations. Don't do that. That's the simple answer. And the second thing I would say is just stay true to your values. Because, the Kremlin propaganda likes to say that we, Russian Democrats, ask for Western support and for US support. No, we're not. We're not asking for your support. We're just asking you to stop supporting Putin. First of all, by treating him as a worthy and respectable partner. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, by allowing his cronies to use Western countries as havens for their looted wealth, to store their money, to have their bank accounts, to buy real estate, to send their kids to study. Just stop doing that. And I think that'll go a long way towards what you're talking about.
I think the administration is on notice now. Does anyone else have a question? Here in the back, in the striped.
Hi, Paula Redondo, Freedom House. My question is for any of the panelists, of all of them. Do you see any possibility for an openness after the elections or just increasing repression? I'm referring mainly to the situation with independent media and civil society. Thank you very much.
I would say that I would see more closing after the elections, and it's unbelievable to me how much closing there has been over the last few years, and that is the overall trend. It's also, we should be mindful that the presidential election is in 2018, so they will get through this election and immediately start thinking about the next one, and be trying to control things even tighter. Which, again, it's how much tighter can it get, but it keeps the kinds of draft laws that we're seeing, things about controlling the internet, things about possibility of exit visas being imposed at some point. So the potential for even greater tightening after the elections, I don't think that they're going to sort of get through the elections and then relax some of these restrictions.
Just comment on what Miriam said about, how can we get even more close than now? We have this saying in Moscow that we finally reached the bottom and then somebody knocked from below. And every time we think it can't get any worse, it does. And we're seeing the closing already now, before the election, during, I'm sure it will happen after. But the only thing is, I'm a historian by training, so I always look at the big picture. And the big picture is that we know that these regimes end. And most of them end the same way. And this one is not going to be an exception. And it may get worse and worse and worse, but at some point it will just stop. And then it will get better. And one quick point also, I don't agree with Miriam on the exit visas. I think that's one thing they will never do, because it's good for them. because it's good for because the people who leave because of the regime are the people who go on Bolotnaya, are the people who vote for us, are the people who protest. They're happy for us all to leave. And I think it's actually one of the biggest crimes of the Putin regime against Russia, that the best people are leaving because of them. Just in the past couple of years alone, there's been, I think, something like 1.5 million people who left the country, and these are the professionals, the educated people, the businessmen, the scientists, and so on and so forth. And it is my sincere hope that once this regime falls, these people, or at least many of these people, will come back, because we will need them. We will need them to build a new democratic Russia. And just like people, I know you're shaking your head, but people came back to Eastern Europe and Central Europe after the fall of communism. And Russia is Eastern Europe. That's a geographical fact. And we will need these people back. Thank you for the question.
We have lots now. Let's go here in the front.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. My name is Sabin Popescu. I'm from Romanian Embassy here in Washington, D.C. The Russian society is a very complex one, from different reasons, historical, religious, and so on. Considering a hypothetical Russian citizen, that it's including all these characteristics of the Russian society, what do you think that will be 3 reasons for supporting Mr. Putin policies line and 3 reasons against it? And which one will be more harder?
3 reasons for?
3 reasons for supporting the Mr. Putin politics line for of today, and 3 reasons against it, this line, supporting your visions about the future of Russia.
For a Russian citizen? Like, why do Russians
For a
support him? Why
hypothetical
do they
Russian
oppose him?
citizen that it's including all the characteristics of Russian
The
society.
typical Russian voter,
Yeah.
I guess, would be the
Speaking hypothetically.
Why people would support Putin?
3 reasons for and 3 against.
Thank you.
If I may, I don't know if I'll be able to do 3, but I'll start. I mean, there is always this discussion about how the overall thesis of enabling the Russian president and sort of imbuing that position with the most power, which is not typical of the rest of democracies, and how it fits in really well with the generally paternalistic expectations of the Russian society. So in that case, obviously, it fits. The mentality fits with the setup of the top-level governance of the country. The reason against would be the, frankly, the economic prosperity or lack thereof. You know, in the last 16 years, we've seen a dramatic change in the trend of economic growth and the reversal of such. So for a large impacted majority of the Russian citizens, the correlation between supporting the presidential heavy setup is broken from the economic benefits and economic prosperity. So, one of each.
Could I comment on that? I'm probably not the right person to name 3 reasons to vote for Putin, but I'll try to repeat what the Kremlin propaganda says. They say 3 things. First, that he's protecting Russian sovereignty from the Americans, who otherwise would have come in and taken over. Secondly, that he's brought stability and he's preventing revolutions. And third, economic prosperity. Well, the first, if you allow me, I won't even comment because we're not in a circus. The second one about supposedly preventing revolution, I think it's 180 degrees opposite, because, you know, if you are eliminating any peaceful constitutional ways of changing the government, you are fomenting revolution, because things change, nothing's forever. But if you are rigging elections, censoring media, putting people in jail for their beliefs, you are the one who are ensuring that the only way this government will change is through a revolution. So the main revolutionaries are not us, they're in the Kremlin. And about economic prosperity, well, you know, if you had oil prices go up from $10 a barrel in the late 90s to 150 at the peak of Mr. Putin's rule, it's not very difficult to achieve some level of economic prosperity. But I think if we look at the reality, we'll see that the level of the economic mismanagement and corruption is such that today, for instance, with about $40 or $50 a barrel oil price, we're having 5% fall in the GDP every year. Whereas 15 years ago, when Mr. Kasyanov was prime minister, we had 8% economic growth, so $25 a barrel, less than today, almost, you know, half of today. And the reason against, I would not even go to 3. I would just limit it 1. They're destroying our country's future in everything they do. They're driving the best people out. They made us into an international pariah and a rogue state. The corruption and mismanagement I mentioned, we've always had corruption in Russia. That's not news. But it's never been at the level it is now. At such an overwhelming level, never, than under these guys. Miriam mentioned Mr. Roldugin. You know, there was a joke in Moscow when that came out that we all thought that Sting was the world's richest musician. Now we know it's Sergei Pavlovich Roldugin, that most people never heard about before. $2 billion for a cellist. They're destroying our future. And I think it's, you know, the only, frankly, patriotic thing to do now is to try to fight them as much as we can.
All right, we have a question there in the back.
Mitchell Pullman. I was part of the OSCE long-term mission in 2011 which Vladimir well knows. My question is, there's been a lot of discussion here about the need for election observation in the OSCE in particular, but the laws that have been passed with respect to observation are so onerous, and all the media I see focuses on the domestic observers and how they apply to domestic observers. I'm wondering if they will try to apply it to international observers, because frankly, I don't see how the OSCE could observe using the approach that the CUC is calling for with domestic observers. As I understand it, they're asking observers to just stay in one place and have to get permission to move from place to place. That renders it completely meaningless. It makes it impossible.
I mean, we could speculate as to whether the same restrictions would be imposed on the OSCE's observers, but the one hope that we have is that OSCE is one of the few organizations of which Russia is a bona fide member of, whose participation in which and whose opinion is truly important to Russia for a variety of reasons. As you know, Russia's state officials have requested multiple times for OSCE's observers to be present in Donbass. So one of the main reasons to not hold the OSCE's observers to the same, standards of limitation during the mission would be not to endanger the relationship as a whole. Ultimately, OSCE could frankly refuse to go, as I've mentioned, even if the invitation is extended.
Just quickly mention on this that from what we see today, most likely the Council of Europe will not be invited, as Pavel mentioned, because there's been statements about it. I think the OSCE will be invited because they seem to be playing this quote-unquote legitimacy game with replacing Churov with Pamfilova, with trying to play nice, put a nice face to this. I think they will extend an invitation to the OSCE, and it is very important for the OSCE to go. And before we came here to this event, we had a briefing at the Helsinki Commission on the Hill, which, as you well know, deals with OSCE obligations. And we passed them the same message. It is very important for the OSCE to go. Because it's one thing when we talk about election fraud in Russia. We are quote-unquote interested parties. We can be pursued as being subjective on this. And it's another thing when an international organization, of which the Russian Federation is a full member state, officially says that there were no conditions for free and fair elections. And so if there's even the minimum possibility to accept the invitation and to go and to observe, I think it should be taken up. And I'm very hopeful that in the upcoming session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE in Tbilisi on the 1st of July, that decision will be taken to send an observer mission, because we need it.
I think we have time for one last question. I saw it over here on this side.
Patrick Bell, the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. I'm very interested in the training aspect that you spoke about, because in the school that I teach in, it's all now about data analytics. I teach a class on political data and analytics and making sure that you're on social media, having a presence, given all the restrictions that now exist in Russia on social media and their prominent use in the 2000 elections. How are you, shall we say, Russians are very inventive, trying to get around that, basically in terms of your election preparation, you might say? For anybody on the panel, obviously, but obviously Vladimir.
Well, there you go. Couple of things. Well, first of all, the limitations have been imposed in terms of online media presence, frankly, debunking the most of the privacy expectations of the Russian citizens. I'm sure, as you are aware, there are multiple levels at which the anonymity of internet browsing can be legally breached specifically by the FSB. And the steps to do so were taken back in 2000, if I remember correctly, 2011, when there was basically a law passed mandating the internet service providers to install special routing bypassing boxes, essentially, that would allow FSB to track traffic regardless of whether or not the ISPs are actually logging such information themselves. In terms of what can be done, well, there are a number of anonymization technologies. Yeah. So fundamentally, a lot of the tools that are used globally are used by Russian citizens. It's pretty much the same set, including virtual private networks, Tor itself, but also just being, people, I think, are now at the point of having encountered multiple instances of privacy breaches where the online, basically being careful online is now one of the top priorities, whereas a couple of years ago, even though the same restrictions and controls were in place, it was just not simply top of mind. So simple things like using your personal device in privacy-enabled settings in public places of assembly, coffee shops, whatever you may, that is able to track your personal identifiable information. All of that, I think, has bubbled up to the top in terms of people following the discussions online. But fundamentally, I think Russia does remain a very restrictive place in terms of online participation. And it starts with the top-level control, the entire RUNET. If you think about it from the infrastructure perspective, is only linked up in a couple of landing sites to the rest of the world, particularly landing sites in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So there are only a couple of places of physical infrastructure entry where you need to install the necessary technology to control the rest of the country's internet access. So that does not go away.
Just a quick comment on this. The Roskomnadzor, which is the government agency dealing with the internet, has been blocking several opposition-related and news-related websites in the last few years. Alexei Navalny's blog is one of them. Grani, which is an opposition news site. But when I'm in Moscow on my cell phone, it takes me maybe 10 seconds to open all of these websites. I mean, there are relatively simple. I'm a complete dummy. I know Pavel is an expert in internet. I know nothing. But even for me, it takes 10 seconds to open these websites. So there are ways to do it. For some reason, though, I wasn't able to access the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee website. I don't know why they seem to be blocking. They seem to be blocking that one more stubbornly than the other ones. But I think on your question, life will find a way. People will be able to still use Twitter, and this includes uncovering the fraud in the election, as Twitter was used massively in 2011. So we saw the fraud in seconds across the whole country because people would be taking pictures and putting it on social media and sending it around. I'm sure even with all the blockages and even with all the restrictions, life will find a way. People who are motivated and who want to do this will find a way to do it.
That optimistic note is probably a good place to stop. And I want to thank everybody for coming and listening and asking such great questions. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me. And if we could all thank our panelists today for a great discussion.